"I'll give you my entire ranch if you can touch that horse," laughed the wealthy rancher, but the young frontiersman left him in silence. Colonel Samuel Whitman stood at the peak of his arrogance when he made that wager that would change his life forever. Before we dive deeper into this twisted story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy. Owner of the largest spread in all of Montana territory, he never imagined his words would turn against him so devastatingly. Before we dive deeper into this twisted story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy this tale of the Wild West. It was during the traditional 4th of July celebration at the Whitman Ranch that everything began. The year was 1878, and the Montana Territory was still raw, untamed country where a man's word was his bond and his reputation everything. Hank Bigfoot Hunter, a recently settled frontiersman of barely 24 years who worked the colonel's land, approached the corral where Thunder stood, the most feared stallion in the entire territory. Hank had earned his unusual name through legend and necessity. Born Henry Hunter in the Colorado Rockies, he'd grown to enormous proportions by frontier standards, 6 feet 4 inches tall with size 14 boots that left distinctive tracks wherever he went. Mountain men and trappers across 3 territories knew those prints, and many swore they'd seen evidence of his passage in places no ordinary man could reach. The Bigfoot moniker had stuck after he tracked a wounded grizzly bear through a blizzard for 3 days, following footprints most men would have lost after the first snowfall. But Hank was more than just a tracker. He was a student of the wilderness, raised by his grandfather, Old Pete Hunter, who had been one of the first mountain men to venture into the Rockies. From Pete, Hank had learned to read the land like a book, to understand the language of animals, and to survive where others perished. When Pete died during Hank's 20th year, the young man had spent 2 more years alone in the mountains before finally deciding to try civilization. The animal before him now, Thunder, was a jet-black Mustang with wild eyes and scars across his flanks. He had become a local legend for his aggression and seemed to embody all the wildness that the advancing frontier was slowly taming. No one could even approach him without receiving a kick or a bite. 3 professional horsebreakers had tried and failed, with 2 requiring medical attention and 1 swearing he'd never work with horses again. "Well, look at that," bellowed Colonel Whitman, his booming voice echoing across the ranch yard. "The mountain man wants to play horse tamer." The guests at the celebration laughed, thinking it was just another of the powerful rancher's jokes. Colonel Samuel Whitman was a man who commanded attention wherever he went. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a carefully waxed mustache and expensive clothes that marked his status in territorial society, Hank stopped halfway to the corral, feeling all eyes upon him. His appearance was a stark contrast to the assembled guests: worn buckskin jacket that had seen countless seasons, weathered hat with a feather from a golden eagle he'd helped rescue, and the kind of deep tan that came from years under the open sky. But his steel-gray eyes held a confidence that made more than one observer reconsider their initial dismissal. "Listen here, boy," continued the colonel, taking another swig of the finest Kentucky whiskey money could buy in the territory. "I'll give you my entire ranch if you can touch that devil horse, but if he kicks you, I want you gone from here and never come back." The crowd burst into laughter. It was impossible, they all agreed. Thunder had injured 3 professional horsebreakers in recent months, and Dr. Harrison, the territorial veterinarian, had warned that the animal showed signs of serious behavioral problems that might require putting him down. "Are you certain about that wager, sir?" asked Hank with a firm voice, his mountain drawl barely noticeable after 2 years of ranch work. He'd learned to moderate his speech around the territorial elite, though his natural way of talking still carried the rhythms of campfire conversations and long silences broken only by wind through pine trees. "Absolutely certain," roared the colonel, pounding his chest with the bravado that had made him both respected and feared throughout Montana territory. "But you won't even be able to get close. That horse is pure evil, I tell you. Pure meanness wrapped up in horseflesh." What no one in that crowd knew was that Hank had been observing Thunder for months with the patience of a hunter waiting for the perfect shot. While performing his daily duties cleaning stables, mending fences, and helping with the cattle drives, he had noticed something everyone else ignored. The horse wasn't aggressive by nature. Hank had seen truly vicious animals in the wild, and Thunder didn't have that particular look in his eyes. There was pain in his movements, a hesitation in his left hind leg that betrayed ancient suffering, and a wariness that spoke of betrayal rather than inherent cruelty. Years of tracking wounded animals through the wilderness had taught Hank to read such signs. A bear with an infected paw moved differently than one protecting cubs. A wounded elk held its head at a particular angle. A horse in constant pain would develop behaviors that others might mistake for pure meanness. Hank approached the corral with the slow, deliberate movements he'd learned from stalking elk in mountain meadows. His moccasin-soft steps barely made a sound on the packed earth. The crowd's laughter gradually died away as they sensed something different about this approach. Even Thunder seemed to notice. The great black stallion raised his head with flared nostrils, muscles tensing for the explosive violence that had become his signature response to human approach. But then something extraordinary happened. Hank stopped exactly 3 meters away, close enough to be heard, far enough to avoid triggering an immediate attack, and began speaking in a voice so low that only the horse could hear the words. "Easy there, partner," whispered Hank, his voice carrying the calm authority he'd learned from years of talking wounded animals out of their pain-driven fury. "I know you're hurting. I've seen plenty of wounded creatures in my time up in the high country, and you've got that look. That look that says the pain's been with you so long you've forgotten what it feels like to be without it." Thunder's ears twitched forward, the first time anyone had seen him show interest rather than hostility toward a human approach. There was something different about this man, something that reminded the horse of open plains and the freedom he'd known before capture, before the pain, before the endless cycle of humans trying to break his spirit through force. Hank extended his hands slowly, palm up, fingers relaxed. He'd learned this approach from watching his grandfather work with wild horses they'd occasionally encountered in mountain valleys. "Show them you're not a threat first," old Pete had always said. "Let them make the choice to trust you." The seconds stretched into an eternity. The crowd held its breath. Thunder stood perfectly still, nostrils flaring as he caught scents that spoke of pine forests, mountain streams, and wide open spaces. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the great stallion lowered his proud head. When Thunder's velvet nose touched Hank's palm, the yard erupted in exclamations of surprise and disbelief. Colonel Whitman dropped his crystal glass, the sound of shattering adding punctuation to his shock. His face rapidly paled as the full implications of what he was witnessing began to sink in. That's impossible," murmured the rancher, his voice barely audible over the excited chatter of his guests. But the proof was undeniable. Hank was now stroking Thunder's forehead with the same gentle confidence he might show a favorite dog, and the notorious killer horse was accepting the attention with what could only be described as relief. Mrs. Catherine Whitman, an elegant woman of 45 who had been observing from the covered porch, now approached with quick, determined steps. She had been married to Samuel long enough to recognize when her husband had made a promise that might cost them dearly. "Samuel," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of managing a frontier household and dealing with her husband's occasional lapses in judgment. "You made a promise in front of witnesses." Everyone here heard every word. The colonel looked around at the assembled crowd with growing alarm. The 4th of July celebration had drawn the territory's most influential people: Judge Henry Cooper, the respected magistrate who had brought law to the frontier; Hector Martinez, who owned the second-largest ranch in the territory; Dr. William Harrison, whose medical and veterinary skills made him indispensable to the community; Jim Riley, his own ranch foreman whose opinion carried weight with every cattleman in Montana; and at least 30 other ranchers, businessmen, and political figures, whose respect was essential to maintaining his position in territorial society. All of them were watching him expectantly, waiting to see if Samuel Whitman was truly a man of his word or just another frontier blowhard whose promises evaporated when faced with consequences. "It was just luck," he grumbled, though his voice lacked conviction. The horse was distracted by all the noise and celebration. "Luck?" asked Hector Martinez, stepping forward with the measured pace of a man who had seen enough of life to recognize truth when he saw it. "Samuel, my friend, 3 professional bronc busters couldn't do what this young man just accomplished. Rodriguez from down in Texas, that fellow Patterson who came up from Colorado, and Jake Morrison, all of them tried for weeks and came away bloodied. You telling me they just didn't have enough luck? Hank stepped away from Thunder and walked toward the group, his movements still carrying that peculiar grace that marked men who had spent years navigating treacherous mountain terrain. His eyes met those of the colonel, and for a moment there was tense silence that seemed to stretch across the entire yard. "Colonel Whitman," said Hank with impressive maturity for his age, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had learned to choose his words carefully in situations where saying the wrong thing might mean the difference between life and death. "Do you keep your word?" The question hit the yard like a physical blow. Samuel Whitman had built his entire reputation on being a man whose word was his bond. In frontier society, where contracts were often sealed with handshakes and witnessed by nothing more than the sky overhead, a man's credibility was literally worth more than gold. He was known throughout the territory as someone who honored his commitments, even when they cost him dearly, though he was also known for driving hard bargains that usually worked in his favor. To retreat now would be equivalent to destroying everything he had spent 20 years building in Montana territory. His business relationships, political influence, and social standing all depended on the community's belief that Samuel Whitman meant what he said. "Of course I keep my word," he responded, though his voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there moments before. "But look here, boy, you don't know what you're asking for. A ranch this size represents the work of 2 decades. It's worth more money than you've ever seen. You don't even have 2 coins to rub together, much less the knowledge to run an operation like this." "You're right that I don't have money, Colonel," replied Hank, his tone respectful but unwavering. "But I've got something that might be worth more in country like this: knowledge of the land, understanding of animals, and the kind of patience that comes from years of living by my wits in places where making the wrong choice means not making any more choices at all." He paused, glancing toward the small cabin at the edge of the property where smoke was rising from the chimney. "And I've got my grandmother, Sarah Bigfoot Hunter, who deserves a roof over her head that doesn't leak when the winter storms come calling. She's earned that much after all the years she's spent following the frontier, helping folks who had nowhere else to turn." Mrs. Whitman drew closer, her face showing recognition at the mention of Sarah's name. Everyone in the territory knew something of the old woman's story. Sarah Bigfoot Hunter was a legend in her own right. A medicine woman who had learned healing arts from her Cherokee grandmother and had spent 40 years moving west with the advancing frontier. She had delivered babies, treated gunshot wounds, nursed families through cholera outbreaks, and saved more lives than most doctors could claim. The old woman currently lived with Hank in a humble cabin at the edge of the Whitman property, surviving on his ranch wages and the occasional payment from grateful families who still sought her healing knowledge. "Samuel," Mrs. Whitman whispered to her husband, moving close enough that her words wouldn't carry to the crowd, "you know as well as anyone that a public wager has legal standing in territorial law. Judge Cooper is standing right there. He's heard every word." The rancher felt perspiration beginning to run down his forehead despite the pleasant July weather. He had indeed played with fire, and now the flames threatened to consume everything he had worked to build. But as panic began to set in, a cruel idea began to form in the back of his mind. The kind of idea that desperate men grasp at when they see their world beginning to crumble. "Fine," he said, forcing his voice back to its normal commanding tone and managing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But let's do this properly, like gentlemen. Touching the horse once doesn't mean taming him. Any fool might get lucky once if the animal was distracted or tired. If you want my ranch, you'll have to prove you really understand horses." Hank waited, his wilderness-honed instincts telling him that danger was approaching as surely as storm clouds gathering over mountain peaks. "I'll give you 30 days, continued the colonel, his voice growing stronger as his plan solidified. "If you can completely break Thunder, not just touch him, but saddle him, bridle him, and ride him like a gentleman's mount, then the ranch is yours. But if you fail, if that horse throws you or refuses to accept you as his master, then you and your grandmother pack your belongings and leave this territory forever. You'll never work for me or anyone else in Montana again. How does that sound for terms?" The crowd murmured among themselves, recognizing that the colonel had transformed what seemed like a simple challenge into something far more complex and dangerous. Completely breaking Thunder would require not just one moment of connection, but sustained work that could end in serious injury or death if the horse's legendary temperament reasserted itself. Hank felt the full weight of the decision settling on his shoulders like a pack loaded for a month-long trek into unmapped territory. 30 days to accomplish what professional horsebreakers had failed to do in weeks of trying. But as he considered the challenge, his thoughts went to Sarah, growing frielier each winter in their drafty cabin, her joints aching from decades of frontier hardships, sleeping on a bed that was little more than straw and worn blankets. "I accept your terms, Colonel," said Hank, extending his hand with the firm grip he'd learned from years of sealing agreements with mountain men and trappers whose lives might depend on keeping their word. The colonel gripped Hank's hand with excessive force, trying to intimidate the young frontiersman through sheer physical pressure. But Hank's grip was like iron forged in mountain streams and shaped by years of wielding axes, handling ropes, and maintaining the kind of physical strength that meant survival in unforgiving country. "Then let the trial begin tomorrow at first light," declared Samuel, his voice carrying across the yard with renewed confidence. "And I want the entire community to witness every day of it. This won't be done in secret where stories can be changed or facts disputed." The celebration continued around them, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The guests formed small groups, speaking in voices that carried both excitement and concern about what they had just witnessed. Some admired Hank's courage and the unexpected gentleness he had shown with the notorious horse. Others believed he had essentially signed his own eviction notice and possibly his death warrant. Judge Henry Cooper, a man whose legal mind had brought order to countless frontier disputes, approached Hank as the crowd began to disperse. "Young man," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect, "I want you to understand that what just happened here carries the full weight of territorial law. That wager was made publicly with multiple witnesses, and the terms were clearly stated by both parties." "I understand, Your Honor," replied Hank. "I wouldn't have accepted if I wasn't prepared to honor my part of the agreement." "See that you do," the judge said solemnly. "But also understand that Colonel Whitman has significant influence in this territory. There will be those who might try to complicate your efforts. If you encounter any interference that goes beyond fair play, I want you to report it immediately." As the judge walked away, Hank was approached by Victoria Whitman, the colonel's only daughter. At 18, she had inherited her mother's graceful beauty and her father's stubborn determination, but unlike her parents, she had always shown genuine affection and respect for the ranch's workers. She had been watching the entire confrontation from the porch, and her face showed a mixture of concern and fascination. "That was either very brave or very foolish," she said, studying Hank's face as if trying to read his true thoughts. "Papa doesn't like to lose, and he especially doesn't like to lose to people he considers beneath his station." "I appreciate the warning, Miss Victoria," Hank replied, "but sometimes a man has to take risks when the people he loves are depending on him." Victoria's expression softened. She knew something of Sarah's story and had often wondered why her father paid such low wages to someone whose grandmother had probably saved more lives in the territory than anyone except Dr. Harrison. "What will you do if you succeed?" she asked. "I mean, if you actually win the ranch, what then?" Hank looked out toward the vast expanse of grassland that stretched to the horizon, broken only by the winding line of cottonwoods that marked the path of Clear Creek. "I reckon I'd try to use it to help folks who need helping," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe set up a place where young men coming west could learn not just ranching, but the kind of skills they'll need to survive out here. How to read weather, track game, find water, deal with hostile situations. The frontier's changing, but it's still dangerous country for folks who don't understand it." That evening, as the last of the celebration guests departed, Hank walked slowly back to the cabin he shared with his grandmother. The small wooden structure sat on a slight rise about a quarter-mile from the main ranch buildings, positioned where it caught the morning sun but was sheltered from the worst of the winter winds by a stand of pine trees that Hank had carefully tended. Sarah Bigfoot Hunter was waiting for him on the narrow porch, her ancient rocking chair creaking softly as she worked on a piece of beadwork that would eventually become part of a medicine bag. At 73, she was still sharp-minded and observant, though her body showed the accumulated wear of 7 decades on the frontier. "So," she said without looking up from her work, "you went and made a bargain with the devil himself." Hank settled onto the porch steps, removing his hat and running his fingers through hair that was still damp with perspiration from the day's tension. "You heard about it already?" "Child, I heard that crowd whooping and hollering from clear over here. Then young Billy Martinez came riding by to tell me what happened before the dust from all them fancy carriages had even settled." She looked up from her beadwork, fixing him with eyes that had seen everything the frontier could offer and had learned to judge character with the accuracy of a hunter judging distance. "Question is, what makes you think you can do what them professional horse breakers couldn't?" "Because they were trying to break Thunder," Hank replied, leaning back against the porch post. "I'm not trying to break anything. I'm trying to heal whatever's making him act like he does." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Your grandfather would have said the same thing. Pete always did believe that most problems with animals come from problems with people first." She set aside her beadwork and studied her grandson's face in the fading light. "But you know this Colonel Whitman isn't going to just sit back and let you succeed, don't you? Men like him don't get to where they are by letting upstart young folks take what they consider theirs." "I know, grandmother. But what choice do I have? You deserve better than this cabin with the wind blowing through the chinks and the roof that leaks every time we get a hard rain. And if I can really help Thunder, maybe I can help other animals too. Maybe even help some of the young men who come out here looking for work and end up getting hurt or killed because nobody taught them what they needed to know." Sarah reached over and placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "You got a good heart, Henry Hunter. Just make sure you keep your wits about you too. Good hearts don't count for much if they're not beating anymore." The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern mountains, Hank was already at Thunder's corral with a bucket of oats and a collection of grooming supplies. The great black stallion stood in the far corner, watching warily as Hank approached. In the clear morning light, with fewer distractions, Hank could see even more clearly the signs that had convinced him Thunder's aggression was rooted in pain rather than natural viciousness. "Morning, partner," said Hank softly, settling himself on an overturned bucket about 10 feet from where Thunder stood. "Figured we might as well get acquainted properly if we're going to be working together." Thunder's ears flicked forward at the sound of the calm voice, but he remained pressed against the far fence, every muscle ready for explosive flight if this human proved to be another source of pain and frustration. Hank made no move to approach closer. Instead, he simply sat quietly, occasionally speaking in the same low, reassuring tone he had used the day before. He talked about the weather, about the quality of the morning light, about the meadowlarks that were singing from fence posts around the ranch. He talked about his years in the mountains, about the wild horses he had occasionally encountered in high valleys, about his grandfather's theories on working with animals. After nearly an hour, Thunder took a tentative step away from the fence. It was small progress, but Hank recognized it as significant. He reached into the bucket and scattered a handful of oats on the ground about halfway between himself and the horse. "No pressure, friend," he said. "Take your time and think it over." By the time Jim Riley arrived to begin his morning routine, Thunder had moved close enough to eat the oats, though he was still maintaining a careful distance from the human who had provided them. Jim Riley had been foreman of the Whitman Ranch for 15 years, and in that time he had seen dozens of men try to work with difficult horses. What he was observing now was unlike anything in his experience. Most horse breakers started with ropes and leverage, trying to establish physical dominance as quickly as possible. Hank seemed to be doing the opposite, establishing a relationship based on respect and patience. "Morning, Hank," called the foreman. "How's our notorious outlaw behaving this morning?" "He's thinking things over," replied Hank, standing slowly so as not to startle Thunder. "I figure he's got a lot of bad experiences with people trying to hurt him. Going to take some time to convince him that not all humans are the same." Jim nodded thoughtfully. He had known Hank's grandfather, old Pete Hunter, and remembered the almost mystical way the old mountain man had been able to work with animals. It looked like some of that talent had passed down through the bloodline. "Colonel's already been by twice this morning," Jim mentioned casually. "Seems mighty interested in keeping track of your progress." "I figured he would be," Hank replied. "Man's got a lot at stake." What Hank didn't know was that Colonel Whitman had spent most of the night pacing his study and drinking whiskey while trying to figure out how to extricate himself from the situation without losing face. The ranch represented not just his wealth, but his identity and his family's future. Losing it to a young frontiersman would be devastating both financially and socially. By the third day of the challenge, word had spread throughout the territory about the unusual contest taking place at the Whitman Ranch. Visitors began arriving daily to witness the young mountain man's attempt to gentle the notorious Thunder. Some came out of curiosity, others because they had money riding on the outcome, and still others because they sensed they were witnessing something that would become part of frontier legend. Hank had made remarkable progress. Thunder now accepted his presence without displaying aggressive behavior and would even approach when called. But Hank knew that the real test would come when he attempted to place a halter on the horse and begin the process of preparing him for saddle and bridle. On the morning of the fourth day, Hank arrived at the corral to find Thunder standing quietly near the gate, as if waiting for his arrival. It was a breakthrough that filled Hank with cautious optimism. "Well, partner," he said softly, approaching with a rope halter in his hands, "I think it's time we took the next step." Thunder watched the approaching halter with obvious nervousness, but he didn't retreat. When Hank gently placed the halter over his head and secured it, the horse stood perfectly still, though his muscles trembled with the effort of overcoming instincts that told him to flee or fight. "Easy, easy," murmured Hank, stroking Thunder's neck with gentle, reassuring motions. "Nobody's going to hurt you. We're just getting to know each other." The successful haltering was witnessed by nearly 20 spectators who had gathered at the corral fence, and word of it reached Colonel Whitman within minutes. The colonel's face went white when he received the news, and his hands shook as he poured himself a morning whiskey that was becoming a daily necessity. It was on the fifth day that Hank made the discovery that would change everything. While examining Thunder's legs as part of his daily grooming routine, his experienced fingers found what 3 professional horsebreakers had missed: a sharp stone wedged deep between the frog and the outer edge of Thunder's left rear hoof. "Well, I'll be damned," whispered Hank, carefully probing the area to confirm what he was feeling. "No wonder you've been so ornery, partner. You've been carrying this piece of misery around for who knows how long." Years of field dressing game and treating injured animals in the wilderness had given Hank steady hands and a thorough understanding of animal anatomy. He could see that the stone had not only caused constant pain but had also created an infection that was slowly poisoning Thunder's system. Removing the stone was delicate work that required Thunder to trust Hank completely. One wrong move, one moment of panic, and those powerful hooves could easily kill a man. But Hank worked with the patience he had learned from his grandfather, talking quietly to the horse while his fingers worked to extract the source of years of agony. When the infected stone finally came free, followed by a discharge of pus and blood that had been trapped for months, Thunder's relief was immediate and dramatic. The horse actually sighed, a sound that several witnesses would later swear they heard, and for the first time in years, he placed his full weight evenly on all 4 legs. "There we go," said Hank, cleaning the wound with water and applying a poultice made from healing herbs his grandmother had taught him to prepare. "Bet that feels a whole lot better." Dr. William Harrison, who had arrived that morning to check on the progress of the challenge, watched the entire procedure with professional interest. As the territory's only trained veterinarian, he was both impressed and somewhat embarrassed that he had missed the source of Thunder's problems during his previous examinations. "Remarkable," he said, approaching Hank as the young man finished bandaging the horse's hoof. "I examined that animal 3 times and never found that stone. How did you know where to look?" "My grandfather always said that animals don't act mean just to be mean," replied Hank, washing his hands in a bucket of clean water. "Most times, when they're acting aggressive, it's because something's wrong. Could be pain, could be fear, could be sickness. You just have to be patient enough to figure out which one it is." Dr. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Your grandfather was Solomon Pete Hunter, wasn't he? I heard stories about him when I first came to the territory. They said he could gentle any animal, no matter how wild or mean." "He had a way with them, all right," agreed Hank. "Used to tell me that every animal's got its own language, and if you're patient enough to learn it, you can usually work things out." Word of Thunder's transformation spread quickly through the crowd of spectators and reached the main house within the hour. Colonel Whitman received the news with a mixture of anger and growing desperation. It was becoming clear that Hank might actually succeed in the challenge, which would mean the loss of everything Whitman had spent 20 years building. That afternoon, the colonel called his most trusted worker, Pete Kowalski, to his study. Pete was a loyal ranch hand who had worked for Whitman for over 10 years and whose family depended entirely on their employment at the ranch for survival. "Pete," said the colonel, pouring himself another whiskey, "I need you to do something for me. Something that needs to stay between us." Pete shifted uncomfortably. He had a feeling he wasn't going to like what he was about to hear. "I want you to find ways to complicate that boy's work with the horse. Nothing that would seriously hurt anyone, you understand, but things that might spook the animal or make it harder for him to make progress." "Colonel, I don't know about that," Pete said hesitantly. "That doesn't seem right, interfering with a fair challenge." "Fair?" exploded Whitman. "There's nothing fair about losing everything I've worked for to some mountain boy who got lucky once. Do you want to keep working here, Pete? Do you want your family to have a roof over their heads and food on the table?" The threat was unmistakable. Pete had a wife and 3 young children, and jobs were scarce in the territory. Reluctantly, he nodded his agreement. "What do you want me to do?" Over the next several days, Hank began encountering a series of seemingly random obstacles. Tools would go missing from where he had left them. The gate to Thunder's corral would be found open in the morning, requiring him to spend time tracking down the horse. Strange noises would occur just as he was making progress with training, causing Thunder to become nervous and skittish. But Hank's years in the wilderness had taught him to be observant and suspicious of coincidences. It didn't take long for him to realize that someone was deliberately sabotaging his efforts. More than once, he caught glimpses of Pete Kowalski lurking around the training area, and his mountain-honed instincts told him that the man was up to no good. Jim Riley, the ranch foreman, also began to notice the pattern of mysterious incidents. As an honest man who took pride in fair dealing, he found himself increasingly troubled by what he was observing. On the 10th day of the challenge, Jim approached Hank privately as the young man was finishing his evening work with Thunder. "Hank," said the older man, looking around to make sure they weren't being overheard, "I think you should know that there are folks around here who might not want you to succeed." "I kind of figured that out on my own," replied Hank. "Question is, what do you think I should do about it?" Jim was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with conflicting loyalties. He had worked for Colonel Whitman for many years and owed the man his livelihood. But he also believed in fair play and was increasingly disgusted by what he was witnessing. "I can't tell you what to do," he said finally. "But I can tell you that your grandfather Pete was one of the finest men I ever knew, and he wouldn't have stood for this kind of underhanded dealing. If you need help, and if what you're asking is fair and honest, you can count on me." That evening, Hank sat on his cabin porch with Sarah, discussing the situation and trying to decide how to proceed. His grandmother listened quietly as he described the various incidents of sabotage, nodding occasionally as she continued working on a new piece of beadwork. "Sounds like this Colonel Whitman is getting desperate," she said when he finished. "Desperate men do stupid things, and stupid things can get dangerous real quick." "I know," replied Hank, "but I can't just quit. Not when Thunder's finally starting to trust me, and not when we're so close to having a real chance at a better life." "I'm not saying you should quit," Sarah said firmly. "I'm saying you need to be smart about how you proceed. Your grandfather used to say that sometimes the best way to deal with a snake is to let it think it's one right up until the moment you grab it behind the head." The next morning brought an incident that nearly ended the challenge permanently. As Hank approached Thunder's corral, he found the horse in a state of extreme agitation, rearing and plunging in apparent terror. It took several minutes of careful observation before Hank spotted the problem. Someone had tied a piece of cloth soaked in the scent of wolf urine to the fence near Thunder's water trough. To a horse, the smell of wolf was one of the most terrifying things imaginable, triggering every instinct to flee or fight. Thunder had probably been in a state of panic for hours, and the psychological damage could undo weeks of careful progress. Hank quickly removed the offending cloth and spent the next several hours calming Thunder and rebuilding the trust that had been shattered by the cruel trick. By the time he had the horse reasonably calm again, he was furious, and he had a pretty good idea who was responsible. That afternoon, he confronted Pete Kowalski directly, cornering the man behind the barn where they wouldn't be interrupted. "Pete," said Hank, his voice carrying the quiet menace of a man who had learned to handle dangerous situations in the wilderness. "I think you and I need to have a talk." Pete's face went pale. He had been hoping his involvement would remain secret, but something in Hank's manner told him that hope was futile. "I don't know what you're talking about," Pete stammered, but his eyes couldn't meet Hank's steady gaze. "I think you do," replied Hank. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. The question is, are you going to keep playing these games, or are you going to let me and Thunder work things out fairly?" Pete was caught between his fear of losing his job and his growing shame at what he was being asked to do. The sight of Thunder's terror that morning had sickened him, and he was beginning to realize that he was on the wrong side of a situation that was rapidly getting out of hand. "Look," he said finally, "it's not my idea. The Colonel, he's scared of losing everything. He told me to make things difficult for you, but I never meant for it to get this bad. That thing with the wolf scent, I didn't think it would terrify the horse like that." Hank studied Pete's face and saw genuine remorse there. The man was caught between impossible choices, and Hank understood that kind of desperation from his own years of struggling to survive. "Pete," he said quietly, "I'm not asking you to lose your job or put your family at risk, but I am asking you to stop helping the Colonel cheat. This challenge was supposed to be fair, and what you're doing isn't fair to me or to Thunder." Pete nodded miserably. "I know. I'll try to find ways to avoid doing what he asks. But I can't openly defy him, Hank. You understand that, don't you?" "I understand," replied Hank. "Just remember that there are other ways to make a living in this territory, and men who cheat usually end up cheating themselves worst of all." Unknown to both men, their conversation had been overheard by Victoria Whitman, who had been walking back from visiting the hands' quarters where she often brought food and supplies to workers' families. Hidden behind the corner of the barn, she had heard every word, and her face burned with shame at her father's behavior. That evening, Victoria approached her mother in the privacy of Mrs. Whitman's sitting room, where Catherine was working on correspondence with friends and family back east. "Mother," said Victoria, settling into the chair across from her mother's writing desk, "I need to talk to you about what Papa is doing to Hank." Mrs. Whitman set down her pen and looked at her daughter's troubled face. "What do you mean, dear?" Victoria related what she had overheard, watching as her mother's expression grew increasingly disturbed. Catherine Whitman had married Samuel when the territory was even wilder and more lawless than it was now, and she had learned to accept certain harsh realities of frontier life. But deliberate cheating in a public challenge was something that went against her deepest principles. "Are you certain about what you heard?" she asked when Victoria finished. "Completely certain. And Mother, it's not just wrong, it's dangerous. If Papa gets caught cheating, his reputation will be destroyed anyway. And if he succeeds in cheating Hank out of his fair chance, word will spread. No one will trust him in business deals again." Mrs. Whitman nodded slowly. Her daughter was showing wisdom beyond her years, and Catherine was proud of the young woman Victoria was becoming. But she was also deeply troubled by the picture Victoria was painting of her husband's behavior. "What do you think we should do?" she asked. "I think we should help Hank," Victoria replied firmly. "Not openly, because that would cause a terrible fight with Papa. But quietly, in ways that give him a fair chance to succeed or fail on his own merits." Over the next several days, Victoria began visiting the training area more frequently, always finding excuses for her presence, bringing fresh water to the workers, checking on the condition of fences, or simply taking walks that happened to pass by Thunder's corral. During these visits, she began offering subtle assistance to Hank. "I've been reading some of the horse training books in Papa's library," she mentioned during one of these encounters. "There's a technique mentioned by a trainer in Kentucky, something about using music to calm nervous horses. Have you ever tried anything like that?" Hank found the suggestion intriguing. "My grandfather used to hum when he was working with animals. Said it gave them something peaceful to focus on instead of their fears." "Maybe you could try humming some of the songs your grandmother taught you," Victoria suggested. "I've heard her singing in the evenings when I walk past your cabin. She has a beautiful voice." That afternoon, Hank began incorporating soft humming into his training sessions with Thunder. He chose old mountain ballads and spiritual songs that Sarah had taught him, melodies that carried the peace and timelessness of high country evenings and campfires under star-filled skies. The effect was remarkable. Thunder's nervous energy seemed to dissipate when Hank hummed, and the horse began to associate the sound with safety and comfort. Within days, Hank could approach Thunder while humming and receive a gentle nicker of greeting in response. Victoria also began providing other forms of assistance. She brought better quality oats from the main house stores, explaining to Hank that horses responded better to training when they were receiving optimal nutrition. She shared observations about Thunder's behavior that she had made during her frequent visits, noting patterns that helped Hank understand when the horse was most receptive to new experiences. "He seems calmer in the early morning," she observed, "and he doesn't like sudden movements when the wind is blowing hard. It's as if the wind makes him remember something that frightens him." These insights proved invaluable to Hank's training efforts. By adjusting his schedule and approach based on Victoria's observations, he was able to make faster progress while minimizing Thunder's stress. By the 15th day of the challenge, Hank had achieved something that seemed impossible when the wager was first made. Thunder would approach when called, accepted grooming without resistance, and allowed Hank to handle his feet and examine him thoroughly. The infected hoof had healed completely, and the horse moved with a grace and comfort he hadn't shown in years. But the most significant breakthrough came when Hank successfully placed a saddle on Thunder's back for the first time. The horse trembled with nervousness but didn't attempt to buck or flee. Instead, he stood perfectly still, trusting Hank to remove the unfamiliar weight when the training session was finished. Word of this achievement spread throughout the territory like wildfire. Ranchers who had dismissed Hank's chances began placing bets on his success. The territorial newspaper sent a reporter to document the challenge, and the story was picked up by papers in Denver and Kansas City. Colonel Whitman read these accounts with growing desperation. The publicity meant that his failure to honor the wager would become known far beyond Montana territory. His business connections and political aspirations would be ruined if he was seen as a man who couldn't be trusted to keep his word. That evening, he called Dr. Harrison to the ranch under the pretense of discussing veterinary matters. In reality, he wanted to pump the doctor for information about Hank's methods and progress. "Remarkable young man," said Dr. Harrison, accepting a glass of the Colonel's finest whiskey. "His approach to animal psychology is unlike anything I've seen in formal veterinary training. He seems to understand that Thunder's aggression was a symptom rather than a character flaw." "But surely he can't actually ride the horse," pressed Whitman. "That animal has tried to kill every man who's attempted to mount him." "I wouldn't be so certain," replied the doctor thoughtfully. "The transformation in Thunder's behavior has been extraordinary. The horse seems to genuinely trust young Hunter in ways I wouldn't have believed possible." This conversation only deepened Whitman's despair. He spent that night drinking heavily and pacing his study, trying to find some way to escape from the trap his own arrogance had created. On the 18th day, Hank arrived at Thunder's corral to find the horse in a state of extreme agitation that was worse than the wolf scent incident. Thunder was covered in sweat, his eyes were wild with terror, and he shied violently away from any human approach. It took Hank nearly an hour of patient observation to discover the cause. Someone had entered the corral during the night and beaten Thunder with a stick or whip, leaving welts and cuts across the horse's flanks and neck. The attack had been calculated to destroy the trust that had been so carefully built while leaving no permanent damage that could be easily traced back to the perpetrator. Hank felt rage building in his chest like a forest fire climbing a mountain slope. This went far beyond simple cheating. It was deliberate cruelty to an animal that had already suffered enough. But even as anger threatened to overwhelm him, his grandfather's training asserted itself. Getting angry wouldn't help Thunder, and it wouldn't help him complete the challenge. Instead, he spent the entire day simply sitting near Thunder's corral, making no attempt to approach or work with the traumatized horse. He hummed softly and occasionally spoke in the gentle voice Thunder had learned to associate with safety, but he made no demands and applied no pressure. Jim Riley arrived in mid-morning and immediately saw what had happened. The foreman's face darkened with anger as he examined Thunder's injuries. "This has gone too far," he said quietly to Hank. "This isn't about winning or losing a wager anymore. This is about right and wrong." "I know," replied Hank. "But getting angry won't help Thunder heal from what was done to him." Jim studied the young man's face and saw a maturity that impressed him. Most men would have stormed off to confront their tormentors or given up in the face of such deliberate sabotage. Hank was choosing a harder path, the path of patience and persistence in the face of injustice. That afternoon, Jim sought out Pete Kowalski and confronted him directly about the attack on Thunder. Pete's horrified reaction convinced Jim that the ranch hand hadn't been involved in this latest incident. "Jim, I swear to you, I had nothing to do with that," Pete said, his face pale with shock. "The colonel asked me to make some noise or move some tools around, but I'd never hurt an animal like that. Never." "Then who did?" demanded Jim. Pete's expression grew troubled. I think the colonel might have done it himself. He was out late last night, and this morning he seemed different. More desperate, if you know what I mean." The realization that Colonel Whitman himself might have beaten Thunder filled Jim with disgust. He had worked for the man for 15 years and had always believed him to be honorable despite his occasional harshness. This crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Word of the attack on Thunder spread quickly through the community, and the reaction was swift and overwhelmingly negative. Even people who had initially supported Colonel Whitman in the challenge began to turn against him. Cruelty to animals was considered a serious character flaw in frontier society, where the relationship between humans and animals often meant the difference between survival and death. Judge Cooper arrived at the ranch the next morning, accompanied by Dr. Harrison and several prominent community members. They demanded to examine Thunder and document his injuries. "Colonel Whitman," said the judge sternly, "these injuries are consistent with a deliberate beating. Do you have any knowledge of how they occurred?" "Of course not," replied Whitman, but his voice lacked conviction and his eyes wouldn't meet the judge's steady gaze. "It could have been anyone. Maybe someone who bet against the boy and wants to make sure he fails." "That's possible," acknowledged Judge Cooper, "but it would be a serious crime. I'm posting a reward for information leading to the arrest of whoever did this. And I'm assigning a deputy to keep watch over the training area for the remainder of the challenge." This development terrified Colonel Whitman. The presence of a law enforcement officer would make further sabotage nearly impossible, and the reward might encourage someone to come forward with information about his previous interference. That evening, Mrs. Whitman confronted her husband in his study. She had heard the rumors circulating through the community, and Victoria had shared her growing certainty that her father was behind the escalating attacks on both Hank and Thunder. "Samuel," she said, closing the door behind her and speaking in a voice that brooked no argument, "I need you to tell me the truth. Did you hurt that horse?" Whitman looked up from his whiskey glass with eyes that were bloodshot and desperate. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," she said firmly. "I've been married to you for 23 years. I know when you're lying, and I know when you're scared. Did you beat Thunder?" The colonel's composure finally cracked. "What choice did I have?" he shouted, jumping up from his chair. "Everything I've worked for, everything I've built, is about to be handed over to some mountain boy who got lucky with a horse. How could I just stand by and watch it all disappear?" Mrs. Whitman stared at her husband with a mixture of disgust and pity. "So you decided to torture an innocent animal? You decided to cheat and lie rather than accept the consequences of your own words." "I was trying to protect our family." "No," she said coldly, "you were trying to protect your pride. And in doing so, you've destroyed everything that made you worth protecting." She walked to the door and paused with her hand on the knob. "I won't be sharing your bed until this challenge is over and you've made things right. And if you do one more thing to interfere with that boy's fair chance, I'll leave you permanently. Victoria and I will go back east, and you can explain to the entire territory why your own family couldn't stand to live with you." Despite the setback caused by the beating, Hank's patience and consistency began to pay dividends. Thunder's trust had been shaken but not destroyed, and the horse seemed to understand that Hank was not responsible for his injuries. By the 21st day of the challenge, Thunder was once again accepting Hank's presence and allowing basic training activities. The presence of Deputy Marshal Tom Bradley, assigned by Judge Cooper to watch over the training area, provided both security and additional pressure. Bradley was a fair-minded man who had heard stories about the challenge and was curious to see how it would unfold. "Never seen anything quite like this," he commented to Hank one morning as he watched the young man work with Thunder. "Most horse breaking I've witnessed involved a lot more violence and a lot less talking." "Violence usually just creates more problems," replied Hank, gently brushing Thunder's coat. "Animals remember being hurt, and they don't forget who did it to them. But they also remember kindness, if you're patient enough to show it to them consistently." Bradley nodded thoughtfully. "Heard you learned these methods from your grandfather. He must have been quite a man." "He was," agreed Hank. "Used to tell me that every animal has something to teach you if you're willing to listen. Thunder's taught me about patience and about how much damage can be healed if you're willing to take the time to do it right." On the 23rd day, Hank achieved another breakthrough. For the first time since beginning the challenge, he successfully mounted Thunder and sat in the saddle for several minutes while the horse stood perfectly still. Thunder's muscles were tense and his breathing was rapid, but he made no attempt to buck or flee. "Easy, partner," murmured Hank, leaning forward to stroke Thunder's neck. "We're just getting acquainted up here. No need to get excited about it." After a few minutes, Hank dismounted smoothly and rewarded Thunder with oats and praise. The horse seemed almost proud of his accomplishment, holding his head high and nickering softly. Deputy Bradley, who had witnessed the entire event, shook his head in amazement. "I'll be damned," he said. 3 professional bronc busters couldn't stay on that horse for 3 seconds, and here you are having a conversation with him from the saddle." Word of Hank's success in mounting Thunder spread through the community like wildfire. The achievement represented a crucial milestone in the challenge, proving that the notorious horse could indeed be ridden by someone who understood his needs and treated him with respect. As the challenge entered its final week, tension throughout the territory reached fever pitch. Bets had been placed on the outcome by people as far away as Denver and Kansas City. The territorial governor had announced plans to attend the final demonstration, and newspaper reporters from 3 states were converging on the Whitman Ranch. Colonel Whitman had become increasingly isolated as his behavior during the challenge became more widely known. Former friends and business associates began avoiding him, and his political allies started distancing themselves from association with his name. The man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in Montana territory was rapidly becoming a pariah. Mrs. Whitman had indeed moved out of the marital bedroom and was sleeping in the guest room. Victoria had barely spoken to her father in days, and the atmosphere in the main house had become so tense that even the household staff were walking on eggshells. Meanwhile, Hank's daily progress with Thunder continued to astound observers. By the 26th day, he was not only mounting the horse regularly but was able to walk Thunder around the corral while seated in the saddle. The horse responded to gentle pressure from Hank's legs and voice commands, displaying the kind of responsiveness that marked a truly well-trained mount. Sarah Bigfoot Hunter had been following her grandson's progress with quiet pride. Despite her age and the various ailments that plagued her, she made the walk from their cabin to the corral every morning to watch Hank work with Thunder. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she told him one evening as they sat on their cabin porch watching the sunset. "Not just because you're succeeding, but because of how you're doing it. With patience and respect instead of force and anger." "I learned from the best teacher," replied Hank, reaching over to squeeze his grandmother's weathered hand. "Everything I know about working with animals came from you and Grandpa Pete." "Maybe," she said with a smile, "but you've added your own wisdom to what we taught you. That horse trusts you in a way he's never trusted anyone else. That's something that can't be taught, it has to be earned." The 30th and final day of the challenge dawned clear and bright. By mid-morning, over 300 people had gathered at the Whitman Ranch to witness the final demonstration. The crowd included ranchers from throughout the territory, government officials, newspaper reporters, and curious spectators who had traveled hundreds of miles to see the conclusion of what had become the most famous wager in frontier history. Judge Cooper had set up a formal reviewing stand for the territorial officials and other dignitaries. Dr. Harrison was present as the official veterinary observer, and Deputy Marshal Bradley remained on duty to ensure fair play and maintain order. Colonel Whitman stood apart from the main crowd, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly from a combination of whiskey and nerves. He had slept little during the previous week, and the strain was evident in his appearance and demeanor. Mrs. Whitman and Victoria took positions near the front of the crowd but noticeably separate from the colonel. Their public separation had been noted by everyone present and added another layer of drama to the already tense situation. At exactly noon, Hank emerged from the barn leading Thunder by a simple rope halter. The horse moved calmly beside him, showing none of the wild behavior that had made him infamous. Thunder's coat gleamed from careful grooming, and the scars from the beating he had received were barely visible. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Judge Cooper in a voice that carried across the entire gathering, "we are here to witness the conclusion of the challenge between Colonel Samuel Whitman and Mr. Henry Hank Hunter. The terms were clearly stated 30 days ago. If Mr. Hunter could completely break Thunder and demonstrate full control over the animal, he would win the Colonel's ranch. If he failed, he and his family would leave the territory permanently." The judge paused to let the significance of the moment sink in. "Mr. Hunter, you have 30 minutes to demonstrate that Thunder is fully broken and under your complete control. The demonstration will include mounting, dismounting, walking, trotting, stopping, turning, and responding to commands. Are you ready to begin?" "Yes, sir," replied Hank, his voice calm and confident. What followed was a display of horsemanship that few of the spectators would ever forget. Hank began by mounting Thunder smoothly and without assistance. The horse stood perfectly still, showing no sign of the aggressive behavior that had characterized him for years. Once mounted, Hank guided Thunder through a series of increasingly complex maneuvers. They walked in circles, figure eights, and straight lines. Thunder responded instantly to leg pressure and voice commands, stopping precisely when asked and changing direction smoothly. Then came the trotting demonstration. Hank urged Thunder into a gentle trot, and horse and rider moved together with the kind of harmony that marked truly exceptional partnerships. The crowd watched in amazement as the notorious killer horse performed like a well-trained cavalry mount. The climax came when Hank asked Thunder for a controlled gallop around the perimeter of the demonstration area. Thunder responded eagerly, stretching into a smooth, powerful gait that showcased both his natural athleticism and his complete trust in his rider. As they completed the gallop and returned to the center of the area, Hank brought Thunder to a perfect halt and dismounted with fluid grace. The horse stood quietly while Hank walked around him, examining his legs and checking his general condition as any good horseman would do after a workout. "Thunder," said Hank in a voice loud enough for the crowd to hear, "stand." Thunder remained motionless. "Thunder, come." The horse stepped forward immediately. "Thunder, back." Thunder backed up 4 steps and stopped. The demonstration concluded with Hank remounting Thunder and riding him through one final circuit of the area at a walk, stopping to face the reviewing stand where Judge Cooper and the other officials waited. The crowd erupted in applause that continued for several minutes. Even those who had bet against Hank's success found themselves cheering for the remarkable achievement they had witnessed. Judge Cooper stood and raised his hand for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we have all witnessed something extraordinary today. Mr. Hunter has clearly demonstrated complete mastery over Thunder, fulfilling all the terms of the original wager." He turned to face Colonel Whitman, who stood frozen in place, his face white with shock and defeat. "Colonel Whitman, do you acknowledge that Mr. Hunter has successfully completed the challenge?" The entire crowd fell silent, waiting for the Colonel's response. For a moment, it seemed as though Whitman might refuse to honor the wager, but the weight of public opinion and his own wife's disgusted stare finally broke through his desperation. "Yes," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "He has completed the challenge. And do you acknowledge that according to the terms you yourself established, ownership of the Whitman Ranch now passes to Mr. Hunter?" This was the moment that would determine not only the outcome of the wager but Colonel Whitman's reputation for the rest of his life. Everyone present understood that his next words would define him forever in the eyes of the frontier community. Whitman looked around at the sea of faces watching him. He saw judgment in some eyes, pity in others, and contempt in more than a few. But he also saw something else, an opportunity for redemption if he was man enough to take it. "Yes," he said, his voice growing stronger. "The ranch belongs to Mr. Hunter. A wager is a wager, and I am a man of my word." The crowd applauded again, this time with genuine respect for the colonel's decision to honor his commitment despite the devastating personal cost. But Hank wasn't finished. As the applause died down, he raised his hand and asked for permission to speak. "Thank you, Judge Cooper," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembly. "But before we conclude this matter, I have something I'd like to say. 30 days ago," Hank began, "I accepted Colonel Whitman's challenge not because I wanted to take anything from him, but because I wanted to prove that Thunder deserved better than he was getting. This horse isn't mean or vicious, he was just hurting and nobody had taken the time to figure out why." He paused to stroke Thunder's neck, and the horse nuzzled his shoulder in response. "Over the past month, I've learned a lot about Thunder, but I've also learned a lot about myself and about this community. I've seen good people do bad things because they were scared, and I've seen other people risk their own security to help someone they barely knew because it was the right thing to do." The crowd listened intently, uncertain where Hank's speech was leading. "The truth is, I don't want to put Colonel Whitman and his family out of their home. That's not justice, that's just revenge. And revenge doesn't heal anything or make anyone's life better." Colonel Whitman looked up sharply, hardly daring to hope that he was hearing correctly. "So I have a proposal," continued Hank. "I suggest we divide the ranch. Half will remain with Colonel Whitman and his family, so they can continue their life and livelihood here. The other half I'll use to establish a training center, a place where young men coming to the territory can learn not just how to work with horses, but how to read the land, track game, survive in harsh weather, and handle the challenges that frontier life throws at them." The murmur of surprise and approval that ran through the crowd told Hank that his proposal was being well received. "But," he continued, "there are conditions. Colonel Whitman must agree to employ at least 10 young men from families that can't afford to pay their own way. He must treat all animals on his property humanely and allow Dr. Harrison to inspect them regularly. And he must contribute 5% of his annual profits to help fund the training center." Hank looked directly at Colonel Whitman. "In return, I'll share everything I've learned about working with horses and other animals. I'll help improve the breeding program and the treatment of livestock on the remaining half of the ranch. And most importantly, I'll give you and your family a chance to rebuild your reputation through honest dealing and fair treatment of the people who work for you." The proposal was far more generous than anyone had expected, and it represented a solution that would benefit the entire community rather than simply transferring wealth from one person to another. Judge Cooper looked to Colonel Whitman for his response. The colonel was struggling to comprehend that he was being offered a second chance when he had expected complete ruin. "Mr. Hunter," said Whitman, his voice thick with emotion, "your proposal is more generous than I deserve. If you're truly willing to forgive my mistakes during this challenge, then I accept your terms gratefully." The crowd erupted in the loudest applause of the day. The resolution satisfied everyone's sense of justice while avoiding the complete destruction of the Whitman family. Mrs. Whitman stepped forward from her position in the crowd and approached Hank with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Hunter," she said, "you have shown more wisdom and compassion than many men twice your age. Our family is deeply in your debt." Victoria followed her mother and surprised everyone by offering Hank her hand in a gesture that was both formal and deeply personal. "I would be honored to help with the training center," she said. "I've learned much by watching you work with Thunder, and I believe education is the key to building a better future for this territory." Judge Cooper officially ratified the agreement on the spot, with the assistance of territorial lawyers who had been present for the original challenge. Within hours, legal documents were being prepared that would formalize the division of the ranch and establish the framework for the training center. The Hunter Whitman Training Center, as it came to be known, opened 6 months later and quickly became a model for similar institutions throughout the American West. Young men from across the frontier came to learn horsemanship, animal husbandry, wilderness survival, basic literacy, and the kind of practical skills that meant the difference between success and failure in frontier life. Hank proved to be not only a gifted teacher but also a natural leader who could inspire young men to achieve more than they had thought possible. His methods emphasized patience, observation, and respect for both animals and the natural environment. Victoria became the center's primary administrator and developed innovative programs that combined traditional academic subjects with practical frontier skills. Her work attracted attention from educators as far away as Boston and New York, who were interested in this new approach to education that prepared students for real-world challenges. Colonel Whitman gradually transformed from bitter adversary to grudging ally and eventually to genuine friend and collaborator. The humiliation of the challenge had forced him to confront his own character flaws, and he emerged from the experience as a better man and a more compassionate employer. Mrs. Whitman threw herself into supporting the training center's mission, organizing fundraising events among the territory's wealthy families and establishing scholarship programs for deserving students who couldn't afford the tuition. Thunder became the center's most famous resident and primary training horse. His transformation from notorious outlaw to gentle teacher became a living symbol of the center's philosophy that healing and education could triumph over violence and ignorance. Jim Riley was promoted to general manager of both halves of the ranch and proved instrumental in implementing the new cooperative approach to ranching that emphasized animal welfare and employee satisfaction alongside profitability. Dr. Harrison established the territory's first formal veterinary clinic on the ranch property and used the center as a base for training young men in basic animal medical care, knowledge that proved invaluable throughout the frontier. Sarah Bigfoot Hunter lived to see her great-grandchildren born and to witness the training center achieve national recognition. She spent her final years as the center's unofficial historian and cultural advisor, sharing her vast knowledge of Native American healing practices and frontier survival techniques with generations of students. When she passed away peacefully at age 78, over 1,000 people attended her funeral, a testament to the lives she had touched and the wisdom she had shared during her remarkable lifetime. Her burial site became a place of pilgrimage for graduates of the training center, who would visit to pay their respects to the woman who had helped shape their education and their character. The friendship between Hank and Victoria gradually deepened into something more profound and lasting. Their shared work at the training center revealed complementary strengths and common values that provided the foundation for a partnership that extended far beyond professional collaboration. Their courtship was conducted with the propriety expected in frontier society, but also with the genuine affection and mutual respect that marked truly successful frontier marriages. When Hank finally asked Colonel Whitman for permission to marry Victoria, the colonel's enthusiastic approval marked the complete healing of the breach that had once threatened to destroy two families. Their wedding, held on the 5th anniversary of the famous challenge, was attended by over 500 guests from throughout the American West. Thunder, now a beloved member of the community, was decorated with flowers and served as an honorary participant in the ceremony. As years passed, the story of Hank Bigfoot Hunter and Thunder's promise became one of the most famous tales of the American frontier. It was told around campfires, written about in newspapers and magazines, and eventually included in school textbooks as an example of how courage, patience, and compassion could triumph over prejudice and injustice. The training center continued to grow and evolve, eventually expanding to include advanced programs in agriculture, engineering, and business management. Graduates went on to become successful ranchers, territorial officials, military officers, and business leaders throughout the American West. Thunder lived to the remarkable age of 28, spending his final years as the gentle teacher of countless young riders who learned their first lessons in horsemanship on his broad back. When he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep, the entire territory mourned the loss of an animal who had become a symbol of redemption and second chances. 50 years after the famous challenge, the Hunter Whitman Training Center had grown into a full university that attracted students from around the world. The original ranch buildings had been preserved as historical landmarks, and Thunder's grave on the hill overlooking the property had become a shrine to the power of understanding and patience. Hank Bigfoot Hunter, now an elderly man with grandchildren of his own, would often sit on the porch of the house he had built for Victoria and reflect on the chain of events that had begun with a simple act of compassion toward a wounded horse. Sometimes, he would tell visitors who came to hear his story, the biggest changes come from the smallest acts of kindness. I never set out to change the world. I just wanted to help a horse that was hurting. But one thing led to another, And before I knew it, we had built something that was helping hundreds of young people build better lives. The lessons taught by Hank and Thunder continued to resonate through generations of students who carried their influence far beyond the borders of Montana territory. The principles of patience, respect, and compassion that had transformed a notorious outlaw horse into a gentle teacher became the foundation for an educational philosophy that emphasized character development alongside practical skills. And on quiet evenings, when the wind was just right and the sunset painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, old-timers swore they could still hear the echo of hoofbeats on the hill where Thunder rested, a reminder that some promises are kept across generations, and some stories never really end. The tale of Hank Bigfoot Hunter and Thunder's promise had become more than just a frontier legend. It had become a testament to the transformative power of understanding, the strength that comes from keeping one's word, and the truth that healing, whether of horses, humans, or communities, requires patience, wisdom, and the courage to see beyond surface appearances to the wounded heart beneath. In the end, it was a story about the American frontier at its best, a place where a young man with more heart than money could, through determination and integrity, build something lasting and meaningful. Where justice could triumph over power, where compassion could overcome cruelty, and where the bond between a man and a horse could change the destiny of an entire community. The ranch still prospers to this day, they say, and the training center continues to prepare young people for the challenges of an ever-changing world. And sometimes, when visitors stand on the hill where Thunder is buried and look out over the vast expanse of Montana grasslands stretching to the horizon, they understand that they are witnessing something more than just a successful ranch or educational institution. They are witnessing the living legacy of a promise kept, a challenge met with courage and integrity, and the enduring proof that in America, a man's worth is measured not by his birth or his wealth, but by his character and his willingness to stand by his word, no matter the cost. The story of Hank Bigfoot Hunter and Thunder's promise became, and remains, one of the great tales of the American West. A reminder that true strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the wisdom to heal what is broken and the courage to build something better than what came before.